Hey, good afternoon, or at least it's afternoon my time. My name is Graham Bodie. I'm a professor at Louisiana State University and Agricultural and Mechanical College in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I've been invited to participate in the Global Professor Program at Korea University. Actually came and visited in December and perhaps met some of you from Professor Levine's class. Today, I'm going to be talking to you guys about dual processing perspectives on persuasion. So over the next couple of lectures, we're going to discuss a broad perspective thought to explain why the impact of persuasive communication is variable. Why are our attitudes changed sometimes, but not other times? Why are some people persuaded by a message while other people are not persuaded by the same message? In a nutshell, this perspective can be called the dual processing or dual process perspective, but there are multiple dual process theories that we will cover in our time together. Today, our goal is to give a background of this perspective to help understand why it was needed to begin with. That is, why did scholars introduce the perspective into the literature on attitude change? The first thing to understand is a working definition of persuasion, so we can all be on the same page. Now, this definition may differ slightly from a definition that's been presented by Dr. Park, but nonetheless, it will be useful for our purposes over the next couple of lectures. Clearly, within the communication discipline, there are multiple definitions of persuasion, and that's okay because definitions are functional, they serve purposes. So our definition is persuasion consists of a subset of social influence whereby a message source attempts to create, reinforce, or change the attitudes, values, beliefs, or behaviors of one or more recipients. All right, so let's unpack this definition. There's four elements of this definition that I think are important. The first is that persuasion is a subset of social influence. Social influence is a class of communicative phenomena that includes but is broader than persuasion. Social influence includes all attempts to influence another person, whether that attempt is intentional or not. So social influence also includes things like social modeling, as when parents influence a child's belief system by simply being the way that they are. They model behavior for children. They teach children about effective or ineffective ways to get things done. Also included in social influence is socialization, as when children take on specific gender roles or religious practices because they've been socialized in a particular group or in a particular setting. The second thing that's important to note is that persuasion is this notion of attempt, not necessarily success. So there's a difference then between being persuaded and persuasion. To be persuaded means that someone has succeeded in changing your thinking or your behavior. Persuasive attempts, however, are also important to study. And so to be inclusive and therefore understand what differentiates successful from unsuccessful persuasive attempts, it's necessary to include attempt and not success in our definition of persuasion. The attempt also assumes the presence of some goal or set of goals and the existence of an intention to reach that goal. And this assumption is grounded in another assumption, basically an assumption that comes from Kathy Kellerman's work. She says no reason to communicate exists apart from a dependence on others for need satisfaction. All communication is consequentially purposive and goal-directed. So there's 2 points here. First of all, need satisfaction is a fundamental part of being human. We want to belong, we want to be included, we want to be loved, and so forth. And a large part of need satisfaction involves changing the affect, cognitions, and behaviors of other people. The second subpoint is that because need satisfaction is a fundamental part of being human, it follows that whether we are aware of them or not, all of our communication is goal-driven, is purposeful. When we attempt to elicit change in some sort of or another, we are acting in an intentional manner, particularly to meet some felt need. The final part of this definition is that there are several types of change and several foci of that change. Miller described three types of change. He talked about response changing, response shaping, and response reinforcing. Response changing is what we generally think about when we think about change. We think about shifting someone from position A to position B, getting someone to agree with our position, getting someone to change from being pro-life to pro-choice, getting someone to change from not recycling to recycle. Response shaping, on the other hand, is basically sees persuasion as a species of the Genesis labeled learning. Social modeling and socialization also fall within this type of change. In this case, persuasion is intentional where socialization is not. Basically, people who you're trying to shape don't have a definitive attitude because maybe they don't know about the subject. And so you're informing them, but also along the way shaping the fact that they even have an attitude in the first place. The final type of change is response reinforcing. This is the basis of going to church services or being in this class, for instance. We're reinforcing in you certain attitudes, certain motivations. And this really highlights the ongoing nature of persuasion, that oftentimes what we're doing is we're reinforcing opinions or attitudes, and we're not necessarily changing or shaping. We're just trying to reinforce attitudes that already exist. There are also several foci of change. We can attempt to change, shape, or reinforce attitudes, values, beliefs, and behaviors. The focus of the dual process perspective is primarily on attitudes. And within this perspective, attitudes are considered the desires or the goals that lead to the intentions to behave. So successful persuasion from this perspective is ultimately a change in a mental state that is thought to lead to some behavioral change. So in order to get someone to, for instance, recycle more, you first need to change their attitude toward recycling to make it more positive and make their intention to recycle more likely. All right, so now we have a definition of persuasion. Like all definitions, the fundamental role of this one is explication. When I define how I'm using a word, I'm referring to features of the world, but the primary function is to make explicit what's up for study. And what's up for study in this set of lectures is the subset of social influence, whereby a message source attempts to create, reinforce, or change the attitudes, values, beliefs, or behaviors of one or more recipients. All right, so we have our definition. Now, the next question is, what makes persuasion possible? How is it possible to change the attitudes of another individual? One reason that persuasion is possible is implicit in our definition of persuasion that we offer. Since people uniformly possess needs and desires they wish to satisfy, and since need satisfaction frequently involves changing the affects, cognitions, and behaviors of others, it seems rather impossible for persuasion not to be possible. If we're going to accomplish many of life's goals, we're going to have to be persuasive. So what makes us more or less persuasive? In other words, what makes it possible for us to meet our needs that we meet on a daily basis? What about us? What about the situation? What about our messages and so forth make persuasion possible? Another way to ask this question is to ask what influences persuasion. There are at least three sets of factors. Source factors. The source would be the person who is attempting to persuade someone. There are recipient factors, factors of the person who is being persuaded or is up for persuasion. And then there are message factors, factors of how you phrase the message, what you say, and how you say it. We're going to focus today on source factors and message factors, leaving recipient factors for a later lecture. All right, so source factors, the most common one talked about is credibility, or the believability of a communicator. And credibility is a judgment that you make of another person in terms of his or her expertise, how expert the person is, whether the person is a novice or an expert, the trustworthiness, whether you can trust the person or not, and their dynamism, like how excited they seem to be about the product or how excited they seem to be about the position. So with expertise, you have the perception of a speaker's competence, their knowledge, their experience. Are they knowledgeable? Are they trained? Are they experienced? Within trustworthiness, you have the perceived character and goodwill and integrity of a source. And with dynamism, you have the perceived charisma, energy, and charm of a source. So people who are more expert, more trustworthy, and more dynamic are perceived to be more credible and therefore should be more persuasive. So for instance, who would you take yoga from? Sometimes there's a reason why credibility matters. So I'm guessing that you're more likely to think the person on the right of the screen is more credible and therefore a better yoga instructor than the person on the left of the screen. And you're probably correct in your assumption. The problem comes when signs of credibility are used as triggers to influence when that cue may or may not be veridical or it may or may not be applicable. So for instance, projected here are images from two popular ad campaigns. The one on the left is for the Canon PowerShot camera. The one on the right is for a fast food restaurant, Hardee's. In neither instance are the pictures relevant to the product. There's no reason that these people should be selling the camera or selling the food. Although the tennis player pictured here is known for her power serve, and thus there's at least somewhat of a connection there, it's loose at best. And in no way is she a credible photographer of any sort. I mean, even if she was, that's not the reason that she's pictured. She's pictured with a tennis racket and a tennis uniform as opposed to in a photographer's uniform or in a professional setting taking professional photographs. As for the fast food ad, well, its demographics is the demographic to which this is tailored is unfortunately likely to watch anything with a scantily dressed and attractive female, and therefore the association is probably going to be there for that demographic. Authority is slightly different from credibility, but is related. With authority, there is a symbol of authority or credibility. There's a title, there's a credential, and the classic example is the physician's coat. You know who the authority figure is in the room, at least in Western medical care, based on the color of the uniform that the medical professional is wearing. The final source factor that we'll talk about is liking, whether the perceiver likes the source and how much. And there are several reasons that we like sources. We like people who are physically attractive. We like people who are similar to us in various respects. We also like people who complement us in various ways, who have different skills or traits or abilities than we do. And we like people who we come into frequent contact with and who cooperate with us. So we like people who are attractive, similar, complementary, with whom we're in contact, and who are cooperative. And all of these elements will give you an advantage as a persuasive source. But just being credible or likable or attractive or an authority figure is only part of the picture. It is also important about the message. So elements of the message also influence attitude change. Perhaps the most used term in the literature refers to a message factor called argument quality. Most of the dual process perspectives that we'll talk about have a pretty vague notion of argument quality, and they're not really interested in explicating that theoretical properties. But communication researchers are, and there has been some research on what makes an argument a good argument. One model is the basic classical canons of rhetoric: invention, arrangement, style, and memory and delivery. Modern social science has defined invention as the content of the message, its logic, its evidence, its substance. So with respect to invention, you have evidence. You have factual statements and opinions other than a speaker's to support a position. So it's not enough to say, well, I think such and such, unless you're a credible source. But even then, you need some sort of proof. You need some sort of reasoning, some sort of logic. You can reason with artistic proof or demonstration. You can reason through, inartistic proof would be demonstration. You can reason through artistic proof, which is reasoning or example, and you can reason through logical proof, where you bring in expert opinion or testimonials. You can use syllogistic reasoning, where you deduce a conclusion from a set of known premises. Within invention, something that's been studied a lot is called one versus two-sided messages. So you can, when you present a persuasive message, you can present only your side of the argument, or you can present both sides of an argument, or multiple sides of an argument. Research shows that when you present multiple sides of an argument and you refute the side of the argument that you're not in favor of, in other words, the side of the argument that is against your position, that's the strongest type of message. So these are called refutational two-sided messages, and they are seen as more persuasive than one-sided messages. But if you're going, but two-sided non-refutational messages are the weakest form of messages. So in other words, you can't just introduce the other side of the message and not refute it. If you're going to introduce the other side of the message, you have to refute that message in order for it to be effective. There's also a relationship between the degree of change advocated. In other words, the discrepancy between the audience's position and the speaker's position, right? There's a curvilinear effect here, such that the further you get away from the more the discrepancy up to a certain point, the higher the attitude change. But at some point, you're going to have a law of diminishing returns. The social judgment theory, which you may have talked about or talk about at some point in the semester, talks about this in terms of the boomerang effect, where attitude change may actually go in the opposite direction if you start to argue a case that's so far away from the other person's position that they just sort of don't listen to anything you have to say, or they start to think that you're so discrepant from them that they start to hunker down and be even more tenacious in their attitudes and in their beliefs. So you want to try to, in your messages, try to target that sweet spot of being discrepant from their attitude but not being so far away that you turn them off. There's also a degree to which you have to be explicit. In other words, and this has to do with the conclusions that you want your audience to come to. So the more the explicit the action that you want someone to take, or the more explicit the attitude you want them to have, those messages tend to be more persuasive than non-explicit or implicit messages. So that's invention. It has everything to do with evidence and with reasoning and with the discrepancy between your attitude and the attitude of the listener, as well as the explicitness of the conclusion. When we're talking about arrangement, we're talking about the order of the messages. The one finding that seems to at least give some advantage for messages is climax versus anticlimax order. Even though the results are inconsistent and the effects are small, we do know that you should avoid sandwiching strong messages between less strong messages. In other words, if you have a set of messages and only one or two of them are strong, you shouldn't put them in the middle of all the weak arguments. And some have suggested to start with the strong argument, because what happens if you run out of time? At least you got to your strong arguments. So with respect to arrangement, that's just the order, whether you put something in a certain type of order. But the research there is really sort of hit or miss. There's not a lot of consistency in the findings. With respect to style, there's also some inconsistency with at least one type of style, which is message framing. The degree to which you frame a message in terms of what the speaker, what the listener is likely to gain out of doing something, versus a loss frame, which is telling the person what they're going to lose if they don't do something. And another style element is powerful versus powerless speech. There's some research to suggest when you hedge, or when you offer qualifiers, or when you hesitate, or when you ask tag questions at the end of a message, that those tend to reduce the persuasive effectiveness because they reduce credibility of the speaker. One particularly poignant style feature is called message person-centeredness. Message person-centeredness is the degree to which your message is basically recognizes that both you and the listener have a set of goals, and messages that are higher in person-centeredness are more tailored to the goals that the listener is likely to care about, as opposed to the speaker's own goals. So to illustrate this, imagine that you have a class assignment and that you really need an extension for this assignment. You really need extra time to work on the project. Your goal is to persuade your professor to give you an extension. And the professor also has goals. So the professor wants to treat all students fairly, maintain the integrity of the course, and similar goals like this. So I've got two example messages, one that's a low person-centered message that I'm going to show first. And this message recognizes only the student's goals in the situation. The message reads, "Professor Park, you have to give me an extension on the term paper assignment. I've been so busy with so many things lately, and I haven't had a chance to work on it. I'm on the social events committee at my frat house and had to help plan a party last week. The week before that, there was a big paintball tournament, and before that, I had a huge exam and a really important class in my major. So I haven't had a chance to start working on the term paper. I really need an extension on this assignment. I have to get a good grade on it. I'll turn it in next week, okay?" So as you see in this message, it's only concerned about what the student's goals are, what the student concerns are, and not about the professor's. It's likely that Professor Park is not going to grant you the extension because none of these excuses basically have anything to do with her goals. They don't match with her concerns. Contrast that with a high person-centered message that attempts to address what the student feels are likely important goals or intentions of Professor Park. "Professor Park, can I talk to you about the term paper assignment? I really love the topic you suggested for my paper. It's so interesting and I'm learning so much. I found a tremendous amount of material on the topic. I want to master all the material and write a really excellent paper, but to do that I'm going to need a little more time than you originally allowed. You told us that we should make the paper something that we're proud of, and I really want to do that. So do you suppose I can turn in the paper next week? I know the extra time will allow me to produce an excellent paper, and one I think you'll enjoy reading." Now, this type of message doesn't guarantee that you'll succeed in shifting Dr. Park's attitudes, but research does show that this second type of message, this highly person-centered message, one that meets the recipient where she is and recognizes her goals, is more likely to result in successful persuasion. But sometimes message content doesn't matter. If it always mattered, then advertisers would always present you with strong arguments that were tailored to your goals, like this advertisement to the right. But they don't do that. They often resort to designing advertisements that contain minimal arguments, but that present pretty people doing what's supposed to be interesting and fun things. The primary perspective that we're dealing with, the dual process perspective, was originally introduced into the attitude change literature to explain when and why persuasion is possible by exploring how certain features of people and certain features of messages influence attitudes, and when and why they often fail. At that time, there seemed to be an endless stream of results that suggested elements such as speaker credibility or attractiveness mattered sometimes and influenced attitudes sometimes, but oftentimes they did not. There didn't seem to be a clear reason for the variable effects of source and message factors. Indeed, many claimed that the concept of attitude was useless and that scholars should abandon the term and focus instead on behavior. In our next lecture, we'll set up the primary arguments for the dual process perspective. We'll talk about the general framework, and then and given the background that we've talked about, and then after that, we'll talk about specific theories that use this general perspective to predict certain outcomes of source factors, message factors, and recipient factors that we'll also touch on in a later lecture. Thanks for listening to me. I hope it was helpful, and I hope Dr. Park can utilize this lecture and expand on some of the ideas that were in it.